Free market economics works both ways. This is why Gen Z is lazy. For example, when Hollywood makes a movie that flops, which they've been doing a lot lately, we don't say people were too lazy to go see the movie. We rightfully recognize that the movie just sucked and didn't give people enough value and incentive to want to go out and see it. The people weren't too lazy to go see the movie. Hollywood was too lazy to make a good enough movie for people to want to see. And in the same exact way, modern corporations in society are as big of a joke as Hollywood now. The salaries, benefits, and overall futures they're offering young people these days is about as garbage as every Hollywood movie has been the last few years. So it's not that Gen Z is lazy for not wanting to accept their garbage. It's that modern corporations and society are the actual lazy ones for not producing a good enough society and economy where there's actually enough value and incentive for young people to work. I was having a conversation with my boomer stepfather recently, as I was genuinely curious how life actually was in the 60s. Unlike most boomers, this guy's actually relatively reasonable and objective, and he admits things have gotten harder today. I asked him what minimum wage and rent were when he was in his 20s. He responded that minimum wage was about $1.85 per hour, and his rent was about $50 per month. To correspond anecdotal evidence with empirical data, I went ahead to double-check and cross-reference this with official historical data. It was surprisingly hard to actually find official statistics of the 1960s economy and living costs. You would think that given we're living in the absolute peak of the information age, where you can look up anything with a click of a button, it should be easy to find. But I had to do a lot of digging to find official statistics. Really makes you wonder if they're intentionally hiding this information in order to keep gaslighting the youth into believing you have it better than ever today. Anyways, after a lot of digging, I finally found some official stats. According to these websites, minimum wage in the 60s was around $1.60 depending on the exact year, and average rent across America was $71. I suppose my dad just found a cheaper than average location, but the point remains the same. Rent was insanely cheap back then. Delusional boomers will often respond with, but wages were lower back then too. So let's see exactly how much wages were relative to rent. Taking out a simple calculator to do some 5th grade math here, we see that 71 divided by 1.6 comes out to around 44.4. This means that in a little over a week's worth of full-time minimum wage work, a boomer could have paid his entire rent for his own apartment for the whole month. This meant that rent only cost 1/4 of his monthly wage, and the other 3/4 could be used on food, leisure, hanging out, enjoying life, going on dates, all things that have become unaffordable for young people today. Keep in mind, this is just a minimum wage job. A job just about everyone back then could get straight out of high school. No training, no qualifications, no student loans debts, no having to apply to a million applications online. Things back then were literally as simple as walking into a restaurant, asking if they needed help. And most of the time, the answer was yes, and they'd give you a job. Not only did jobs pay way more, but they were way easier to get. Now let's compare this to the rent minimum wage ratio for Gen Z today. Rent prices across America average out to $1,739 today. Minimum wage is the same dogshit $7.25 it's been since 2009. Do you remember that boomers only had to work 44 hours to pay their whole rent? Keep that figure in mind because the next number is about to shock you. When we divide today's average rent by the minimum wage, the amount of hours Gen Z would have to work just to pay their rent is a shocking, brace yourselves, 240 hours. This is a shocking 6 times more than what boomers had to do. And please spare me the whole, oh, if you don't want to work minimum wage, you need to go out and acquire a skill. What skill did you have to acquire to make effectively 6 times more money in the 1960s? That was the minimum wage that just about everyone was able to make back then, even out of high school. It wasn't like back then you had to get a PhD and wear a nice fancy suit just to make the minimum wage. So just cut the crap with that nonsense. Now, let's do one more stat comparison here. What hourly wage would Gen Z have to make in order to match the purchasing power that boomers had with the minimum wage in the 60s. In other words, you remember how boomers could pay their entire month's rent in just 40 hours, or a week's worth of work. How much would Gen Z have to be making per hour in order to be able to do the same? To find out, let's put our 5th grade math skills on again and divide $1,739, the average rent price, by 44. The answer comes out to a shocking $39.50 per hour. That's right, the average boomer was making the equivalent of $40 an hour on a minimum wage job. Now let me ask you this. If you could easily get a $40 an hour minimum wage job straight out of high school by just walking into a venue and asking for a job, do you think that might motivate people to work more? Do you think that might make people, quote unquote, less lazy? These are all obviously rhetorical questions that don't even need answering. It's time we start looking at laziness as a two-way street. All of the problems you see in today's economy originated in the 2000s, when the oldest Gen Z were children and the youngest weren't even born yet. Blaming Gen Z for this is a legitimately, clinically insane opinion to have. Gen Z is being blamed for not fixing an absolute dumpster fire of a mess they inherited. Meanwhile, boomers were literally handed everything on a golden platter from their parents' generation, and all they had to do was keep the momentum going. I can understand not being able to improve your current situation, but being handed an absolute economic utopia and somehow managing to throw it all down the drain is just a completely unforgivable sin. And then on top of that, being delusional and narcissistic enough to blame the next generation as being lazy for not cleaning up the massive mess you created. This is just the worst generation ever. You're the actual lazy ones for not cleaning up your own mess. Boomers are extremely pro-capitalist and like to look at everything through a capitalist lens. I've made my opinions very clear that I think capitalism sucks, but for the sake of conversation, I'm willing to listen to capitalist philosophies if you apply them fairly and consistently. If we're going to think of everything from a supply and demand framework, then we need to equally apply it to corporations as we do to individuals. We always tell individuals that their garbage low wages are justified because there just isn't that much market demand for their skills. Well, it's time we throw their own logic right back at them and force them to live by their own philosophies. If no one wants to work, it's not because they're lazy. It's because you're too lazy to pay them enough money. It's because there's just not enough market demand and incentive to work for the dog shit low wages you want to pay.